It's a persistent fear that America in 2012 is a nation in decline, a superpower no longer certain of its role in the world. To help us determine what's behind the malaise, we're joined in Hamburg, Germany, via Skype by Joseph Joffe, publisher and editor of the German weekly Die Zeit. In Fresno, California, via Skype, Victor Davis Hanson, senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and the author of The End of Sparta. In Rochester, New York, Mark Rice, chair of the Department of American Studies at St. John Fisher College and the creator of the blog Ranking America. And with us here in studio, Sergei Plekhanov, political science professor at York University and former deputy director of the Institute for U.S. and Canadian Studies in Moscow. And it's a pleasure to welcome back three of you to this program, and Mark, to welcome you for the first time joining us here on TVO. I just want to start our program by reading an excerpt from Frank Rich in New York Magazine, which he wrote earlier this summer, and it goes like this. If there's one battle cry that unites our divided populace, it's that the country has gone to hell, and that almost any modern era, with the possible exception of the Great Depression, is superior in civic grace, selfless patriotism, and can-do capitalistic spunk to our present nadir. For nearly 4 years now, since the crash of '08 and the accompanying ascent of Barack Obama, America has been in full decline panic. Books by public intellectuals, pundits, and politicians heralding our imminent collapse have been one of the few reliable growth industries in hard times. Let's just go around our literal and metaphorical table on this one. Sergei, why don't you start us off? Do you think most Americans think that they're going to hell in a handcart right now?
I think they're more concerned and alarmed than for quite a while. And I think part of it has to do with the fact that many Americans were hopeful that by electing Barack Obama, they would have seen substantial improvements. And of course, it's easy enough for the Republicans to say Obama failed because, you know, we haven't seen really a rebirth of America's greatness, or the economy is still in bad shape, improving slightly, and so on and so forth. But I think it's unfair. I think the problems that America is confronting are very serious, fundamental, and some of them go very deep into the way the country works or does not work. And Obama has not actually been given a fair chance to cope with those problems. Some of his reform initiatives, as you know, were stymied by a recalcitrant extremist opposition in the Republican Party. So I think part of it has to do with disappointment with this administration.
Victor Davis Hanson, is America going to hell?
I don't think it is, but that's been the American polls suggest that that's been an American fear for the last decade. And it's not based necessarily on abstract data. If you look at demography compared to the major industrial countries, if you look at military power, if you look at energy reserves, if you look at the top universities that are rated among the top 20 in the United States, in the world, and the United States does pretty well, but it's a phenomenon of the Iraq and Afghanistan war, and then the inability to affect things in the Middle East, as well as this staggering deficit that the debt that increased $4 trillion under Bush and has gone $6 trillion almost in the last 4 years. So short term, people are worried, but if you look at the long term trends, I don't think the United States is in too bad a shape.
Mark Rice, your view.
I think that a lot of Americans are concerned about where the country's at right now and where their own economic well-being is. I don't know that most Americans think in terms of the historical trajectory that would have them come to the conclusion that America is in a state of decline. I think that there's a lot of a lack of data, I think, that a lot of Americans have about where the United States actually stands in comparison to other countries. In some areas we do quite well. In other areas the United States does lag other industrialized democracies. So I think there's real fear, but I don't know that the trajectory, the notion of America in decline in a global way, is something that most people tend to think about.
And Joseph Joffe, your view.
You know, the problem with us pundits is looking at the quote by Rich, is that we don't know history. We always confuse the present with eternity. So let me just introduce a little history. Americans are obsessed with decline, and we now are in decline 5.0. Number one was in the 50s, when little Johnny couldn't read, and the Russians were about to get the United States. In the 60s, it was once more Russia supposedly overtaking America in the arms race. In the 70s, it was suddenly Europe. In the 80s, it was Japan, by the way, about which books have been written. We only need to exchange Japan for China, and you have an apropos book, so to speak, for Decline 5.0, where now the Chinese are going to inherit the world. Now, we know what happened to the Soviet Union. It's gone. We know what happened to Europe. It is the one continent that is seriously declining, and there are data to prove the point. There's Japan in a 20-year slump, and then there is China and the United States. But as Victor said, by any set of data, it's very hard to prove that the United States is in the way down and out. And he said it. I mean, it's the largest armed forces in the world, the most sophisticated one, the largest economy in the world. It is the only country in the West that is growing in terms of population. It is going to be the youngest population next to India in this century. And so whatever data you take, there is the United States. Let me use a close with a metaphor. Lots of other nations have power too, they have chips. But the United States has the biggest pile of chips and the most piles in different colors: military, economic, cultural draw, diplomatic clout, etc. So we have to look at why is it that declinism always shows up every 10 years. And we'll talk about it later, I assume.
Well, that seems like a good place to pick up from. Victor Davis Hanson, do you want to pick up on that? Why do we see this descent into declinism or declinism, depending on how you want to say it, which seems to show up every decade or so?
Well, I think it's a symptom of an increasing technological progress, for one reason. Yesterday's 3,000 suitcase cell phone that only the elite could have, today has been transmogrified into a cell phone that 300 million people have access to. Today's Kia has more appurtenances on it than 20 years ago Mercedes did. And what that does is that creates an ever-growing expectation, larger and larger appetites. How we decline the poor or how we decline failure today would be considered success just 20 years ago. If you look at the big problem in America today is not malnutrition or rickets, it's obesity. And so what has happened is the country has gone, continually gets materially more rich, and the government gets larger, and its responsibilities for the welfare of its citizenry grow, and the technology leaps in astronomical ways. We think that we need more and we're more and more disappointed that we haven't achieved utopia when it seems ever more within our grasp. We forget that we're human, and humans have innate limitations. We die, we're not necessarily all powerful or all wise, we age. And the fact that we look, most of us look 60 at 80 when our parents looked, if they even lived that long, they look 90. We still are increasing. We're increasingly upset and frustrated that we can't look youthful all the time. So I think a lot of this declinism, especially in the West in general, but in the United States in particular, has a long history of material success and an ever-increasingly affluent lifestyle that makes people more and more frustrated.
Sergei Plekhanov.
I think there's more to it than a perceptoral issue, like what we compare it with or how high the United States still ranks among the nations. I would like to remind us that the United States is the 20th biggest indebted nation in the world. And 20 years after the supposed collapse of communism, it is the communist China that is the biggest lender to the United States. And the US pile of debt is staggering, and that's one of the manifestations of big problems with the American economic system. But as far as the majority of the American population is concerned, I think the growth of inequality and the stagnation in social mobility, where increasingly where you are, your station in life, you're going to stay until the rest of your life. And that goes contrary to centuries of American experience. Generations upon generations believe that this is a country of equal opportunity, at least to some degree, and the next generation is going to be better off, and you can rise up the social ladder. But all indicators today suggest that that ladder isn't working, or at least it's working only slightly. And as far as the growth of inequality, it's really staggering. In the recent book, The Price of Inequality, written by George Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, it is stated that the top 0.1% of American families, on the average, make 220 times more than the average family of the rest of the Americans. And in fact, he gives another figure, 20%, 1% of the population make 20% of the income and own 1/3 of the nation's wealth. Now, only 20 years ago, it was 12% of the income. And this inequality combined, I mean, if social mobility had been there, then I think most Americans would have more readily accepted, okay, this is a country where anybody can get as rich as he can. But if the bulk of the population is stagnant and some people getting outrageously wealthy, I think that kind of percolates. And then there's an issue. Okay, we have a new administration which supposedly was trying to do something about it and was not allowed to do so.
Mark Rice, let me get you to follow up with this. I think it's accurate to say that the American defense budget is larger than the next 13 countries combined. And Joseph Joffe has given us a good list of the previous 4, or maybe now we're on our 5th incarnation, of how America is going to hell and can't keep up with the Soviets, the Japanese, the Chinese, the Europeans, whatever. Is it not also accurate to say, though, that every time in history an empire felt this secure about its position, it fell? And that just because it's been this way doesn't mean it always will be this way. Is that accurate?
I can't answer about every country, every empire in history, because I don't know enough of that history myself. But what I can say is that I think that this narrative of decline does depend on this narrative of exceptionalism, that America is somehow special, somehow unique, and that it is not, it's not tied to the forces of history, and I think that that's incorrect. I think that the United States is, it's a wealthy country, obviously. It's the wealthiest country in the history of the world. It's the most powerful country militarily. It's the country that most people want to go to insofar as they want to go somewhere. It's the top destination choice for immigrants from all over the world. And so, I think that the United States is an immensely powerful country, obviously, and has been for quite a long time, and probably, and will be for a very long time. But I don't think that it's an inevitability. I think that the forces of history that affect other countries do affect the United States, and that at some point, if not impending, at some point the United States will no longer be the wealthiest, most powerful nation in the world. And as an American, I'm okay with that. I think that that's an okay thing to have happen.
You are not worshiping at the altar of exceptionalism enough then, Mark, is that right?
No, to my mind, American exceptionalism is more interesting as a narrative, as a story. It's not grounded in empirical data, as far as I can see. There certainly are things you can point out, the wealth, sure, the military expenditures, but that's a choice whether to make those expenditures or not. But no, I mean, I think that there's a powerful story that influences the way Americans think about themselves, the way that policy decisions are made. But I don't think that American exceptionalism is accurate. I think the United States is a powerful, wealthy country with a lot of great things going on, but I don't think it stands outside the forces of history at all.
Let's hold off on the exceptionalism debate for a second yet, but Joseph Joffe, I think what I asked the previous question about the defense budgets and about previous empires in history, I think I heard some irritation in your voice in reacting to that question. Tell me what you meant.
No, it was because empires in the past fell because they were conquered. Rome was conquered by Germanic tribes, and all the way down, empires used to rub up against each other. They fought with each other, and they ultimately killed each other. And that's the story of empire from Carthage, if you wish, or Persia, down to the 4 dead empires of the beginning of last century, like the Russian or the Ottoman Empire. Now, the big exception, that's one exception, we talk about exceptionalism, is America need not fear the fate of Rome or Turkey or Persia or what have you. There is nobody now and in the foreseeable future which could take on and could take out the United States. So that's so much for the history of empire. But should we continue about exceptionalism?
Well, hold off on that, because I'm going to get back to exceptionalism in a second. And I do want to read something, though, from Chris Hedges in The Walrus, which is a bit like Canada's Harper's Magazine, and that I can get you all to react on that. Maybe Victor Davis Hanson, you'll start with the reaction on this. Here's what Chris Hedges writes in the November issue of The Walrus. He says, America has been hollowed out by corporations that were indifferent to the working men and women who turned the nation into an empire of unrivaled power and unequal prosperity. But management wanted more. Why pay $20 an hour when you can go to Bangladesh and pay 25 cents? Why settle for a few million in personal net worth when you can double or triple that? The empire was all ripped down. The work was shipped overseas, the factories were closed, the unions were broken, the social programs that permitted unskilled laborers to buy a house, send their children to college and retire with an income, all of this was shredded. America, as doctors say of terminal patients, is circling the drain. This speaks a bit to what Sergei was talking about a moment ago. Victor, would you pick up on that and give us your view on whether you think America is circling the drain?
Well, that was factually incorrect, because we have more people in the history of the United States that are now on food assistance, for example, almost 50 million. Last month, we had the highest number of people who have ever filed for disability. This is, as a percentage of GDP, government and entitlement has never been bigger, and it's never been more generous. I'm not worried about what the 1% get. If Donald Trump or George Soros have 9 or 10 billion, that's their business. But believe me, their hot water is no hotter than mine. Their private jets get to New York maybe 2 hours before I do, sitting in the middle of an economy. I'm worried about the 99%. And I live in a state that's $16 billion in debt. I live in the second poorest county in the poorest quadrant. And this morning I went out to a food market. I saw the parking lot full of Honda Civics, Toyota Camrys, people with EBD cards. Again, malnutrition was not the problem, or a lack of appurtenances. There were all sorts of electronic goods that people were bringing out from Best Buy. So there may be a problem with America's spiritual health, but it's materially a poor person in America compared to most people in the world is wealthy beyond belief. And as far as military spending, the key is not dollars, it's GDP. The United States is spending still between 4 and 5% GDP. By historical measures, it's either average or below average, and it's not really a choice to have a big military. A lot of people would like to choose to have a big military. It's based on having an economy that's 1/4 of the world economy. As far as Barack Obama, I mean, I'm not going to get into politics, but he entered office with a bright vision of how he could change America by growing government. And for 2 years, he had a very rare in American history where you have a compliant Congress, Democratic House, Democratic Senate, and he did make a genuine attempt to do so. So we have a perception that we're in decline because, as I said, we have visions of utopia because it's wealthy. And we have a lot of problems with debt. We have a lot of problems with crime. But if you look at what constitutes being poor in America versus when I grew up in the 50s and 60s, it's just lunatic to say that people are in Dickens's London. It just doesn't happen, or in the old Soviet Union.
Sergei, let me get you to respond to that.
Well, the fact is that for about 30 years, the earnings in real terms of an employed male in the United States have not risen. The consumption has risen because of the enormous blow-up of the credit sphere. That's why so many people are so deeply in debt. But as far as the purchasing power, it has stagnated for over a generation, and that's a real problem because that's not what used to happen before. Real purchasing power in the economy used to grow for the majority of the people, and it's no longer growing for the majority of the people. And that means that your economic growth is not going to be robust. It's going to be based on inflated credit sphere. But you can go only so far in borrowing, and then you stop borrowing. Look what's happening in the European Union. They're now solving the problem of this indebtedness by cutting into the sources of economic growth. So purchasing power declines, there's less money to go by, and there's more money to pay out your debt. Your economy goes into a tailspin. This is what the circling, whatever the comparison was.
Circling the drain.
Yeah, circling the drain. Unfortunately, this is a picture of the real economy. Whatever we compare it, if we compare it with the previous generations, it's not the gizmos that you can get in your Kia. is how much you really make as compared to, and what you can buy for that. And whether you feel that you are on the upward slope or on a ladder, upwardly mobile, or whether you're stagnant or whether you're going down.
Joseph Joffe, can I get you to comment on that circling the drain metaphor? Do you think it's apt?
Well, we first have to make a distinction here about the topic we are talking about. Are we talking about what's happening inside the United States, whether inequality or mobility are rising or falling? That is a very interesting issue, and as a parenthesis, I would say, to the numbers cited according to Stiglitz, I can play that game if I just choose the right brackets in any Western country in the world. When I choose the right 0.1%, I can come up with astronomical differences in income and wealth. But be that as it may, and by the way, the only one thing that I heard that is true here is that apparently mobility is declining in this country, and that has lots of reasons. But I don't think it has anything to do, except in the very, very, very long run, whether the United States is declining. Decline has to do with rates of change. Is A or B or the United States growing faster, performing better, or not? And on almost any measure, it is very hard to say that the United States is performing less, except compared to China, which, like all countries that start off from a small base, end up with very high growth rates, as did Japan, as did Taiwan and South Korea. And when that phase has passed, growth comes down to a more normal level, as is happening right now in China. So we have to look at rates of change. That is the issue of decline. And if you want to have a really poignant, dramatic instance of decline, you look, unfortunately at Europe, two numbers which measure the change. The United States growth, economic growth, decade by decade, in the last 40 years, has come down by 0.5% to the point where 3% growth in the 70s have now dwindled to about 1% or 0 this year, but that's cyclical. That's one sign of real serious decline. The other sign is share of the global product. As Victor said, the United States has held steady for about 40 years, around 25-26% of the global GDP. The Europeans have lost 10 points. Now, you want to talk decline? You got to talk about Europe. You want to talk about the engines or the brakes that slow Europe down? You have to look at the inside. But we must not confuse domestic arrangements, which are said to be horrible, as I heard here twice, with the issue of decline. So if we want to talk about decline, we have to think in comparative terms. We can't just look at the United States, because then it becomes a different debate.
Understood. Let's move on to what I think you were all a bit champing at the bit to get at just a few minutes ago, and that is this notion of American exceptionalism. And Mark, I'll start with you on this, because you said something which to a Canadian's ear sounds almost heretical, which was that you understood what American exceptionalism was, but you were okay with the notion that America was not the indispensable hyperpower in the world, so much further ahead and indispensable to the way the world works as it might have been 20 years ago. Tell me why you feel that way.
Well, I guess maybe because I'm a parent of two small kids, and my dreams for them are not so much linked to America as a global hyperpower. My dreams for them are more about economic stability, a chance for prosperity, strong civil liberties. And I think that these are things that the United States has, maybe not as much as some of us might like in all categories, but they're also things that are found in many other countries as well. And the blog that I keep, Ranking America, lists some of these things, and I won't go into too much detail with this, but according to some standards, the civil liberties in the United States, we're not even in the top 40. We're not in the top 20 in freedom of the press. These are things that concern me for my country, for my children, for my fellow Americans. So whether or not we're an indispensable global hyperpower is something that is really just something that I don't buy into, and I never have. And I'm a professor of American studies, and I teach this stuff. So, yeah.
Victor Davis Hanson, just to make sure we're all speaking the same language here and to obviously make sure our viewers understand what we're talking about, can you give us some idea of how this notion of American exceptionalism came into being in the first place?
Well, in the 20th century, it was the growth of the American economy. It came out of nowhere and became the largest economy in the middle of the 19th century, and it just dwarfed other economies in the 20th. It was a story of the United States being pretty much disarmed in 1917 and 1939 and rushing into 2 world wars and making a key difference along with its allies. It was this notion, as Joe talked about, that at each juncture where rising powers seemed to come out of nowhere, Nazi Germany, Italian fascism, Japanese nationalism in the 30s and 40s, and then the Soviet threat, and then the Japanese and the EU, and now China. At each juncture, the United States has adopted, shifted, transmogrified, and found its role was pretty much the same as being preeminent. I don't think a lot of Americans go around thinking, you know, gee, I'm happy that we're exceptional, but there is something about the United States Constitution. It's the oldest, we are the oldest democracy now in the world, and that Constitution has not been able to be emulated by any other country. It's a very complex but simple document that provides a Bill of Rights, a separation of powers that goes back all the way to classical antiquity. It's a brilliant document. And then we're a multiracial society where it's increasingly hard for someone abroad to say this is what an American looks like. And whenever we see that, multiracial societies, whether it's in the Balkans or in Africa or in South America or even places in Europe, there's a lot of racial and social chaos. And we're not perfect, but we seem to be able to handle that through a vibrant popular culture and a grassroots democracy. And finally, this country has a history, as I read the founding fathers, of being very democratic, but very worried about the excesses of democracy. So in our DNA, so to speak, our constitutional lifeblood, we have bizarre things that are exceptional. They're not found anywhere. The Electoral College, for example, or 2 senators for every state, even though Montana might, only have 500,000 people represented by a senator, and we in California only get 2 for 37 million. So there was a deliberate effort on the part of our founders, looking through the vast scape of history, that they wanted a Republican government that allowed constitutional and consensual history, but they wanted to prevent the excesses of what 51% of the people could do on any given day. And that lent a degree of social and economic stability that I think is quite exceptional when compared to the opportunity. And finally, China was brought up, and it is true that financially they're in a very good position, but 400 million people in China have never seen a westernized doctor. They have degrees of pre-industrialization that are stagnant, and they have not squared the circle of a hyper-capitalist economy and constitutional government yet. And they have a demographic time bomb that's unique, and that not only is it shrinking, but it's gender specific, which is going to cause it enormous social dislocations in the decades to come. So I don't think it's a triumphalist to say that America is exceptional, but it plays a role that we have not seen in the world by any other country in the last century, and I don't see any reason why it will not in the future. There's people tonight who go to bed in GNC or the Sea of Japan, and the reason that China is not occupying an island off the Korean coast or the Philippines or Tokyo or Formosa, or why Turkish overflights of the Aegean are adjudicated, is because of American military power. And if we were to decline, there would be a vacuum. Other powers would fill that vacuum, and I'm not convinced that they would adjudicate those differences in a way that would be any better, and I think much worse in most cases.
Sergey, let me pick up on that with you. I think it's fair to say that most Canadians, when they go to bed, like being Canadian, but don't burn with this need to export quote-unquote Canadian values all over the world, or Canadian culture all over the world. My understanding of Americans is they do.
Because
where'd that come from?
It comes from the circumstances of the American Revolution. We represent 2 sides of the barricades of 1776. The Americans are the rebels who, rebelled against the legal government of King George, and the Canadians were the loyalists who remained under that government. Canada is more like a country. America is more like a project. America is not just a country, it's a project There's a profound ideological commitment at the very founding act of the United States. Seymour Martin Lipset, who has written famously about American and most perceptively about American exceptionalism, listed 5 founding principles on which America is based. And these principles continue to affect the way Americans see themselves and the world around them. And these principles are liberty, equality, individualism, populism, and laissez-faire, free market economics. Now, the big question is whether those principles do not come into conflict with each other. And the problem that the Americans are facing now is that they do. In particular, if you unleash the forces of free market, it does not follow that your democracy will blossom or that there'll be more equality. If you are too individualistic, you will be preventing your government from acting in the public interest as every democratic government should. So you'll be getting a sense. Now, what we're witnessing now is a revival of this ideological struggle between different founding ideals of the American republics, whereas the Republicans are emphasizing individualism and free market and kind of castigating those who work in the state sector or receive anything from the government, even though almost every American receives something from the government, castigating those as being kind of leeches on the body of the taxpayer. And I think the problem is that right from the beginning there were frictions and clashes between those elements of the creed, but the creed is still there. And there are ways in which you can actually renegotiate the creed or invoke it in different ways. And I think the Americans have done that several times. It's not the first crisis that America is facing. That's why those who are saying this is a terminal decline of America, I'm quite skeptical about that. We haven't seen it yet. Mm-hmm. I think what we have seen in recent years with the election of Obama and the revival of movements for change in the United States, to some degree even the Tea Party, is one of the manifestations of the Americans' willingness and intent to redesign their government and to kind of review the way things are done, even though some of it may create some discomfort and some undue instability in the country. I think this is actually this is a mechanism. The fact that it is a project, I think, goes a long way toward explaining why the Americans are perennially concerned about whether they decline or not. Because if you made some kind of a sacred covenant at the beginning of your republic to prove to God and humanity at large that you're doing something right, better than anybody else, then if there are signs that you're not doing something right,
that's problematic.
That's problematic. It goes deep.
Well, let me go to Joseph Jaffe on this then. As we consider this exceptionalism of the American project, which I know you believe in, would you tell us whether you think it's actually America or Americans who are exceptional?
Now, I want to preface this with that both countries, beginning with the Israelites, in fact, the Israelites invented the idea of exceptionalism. Chosen people believe in the exceptionalism. But I think in the American case, it's quite obvious. It is, as somebody said before, it is a country that indeed kind of came out of history, so to speak. It started at a point in history, the 18th century, Enlightenment, which made this country the only true child of the Enlightenment, but a different and more benign Enlightenment than the French Enlightenment, which, as you know, ended in the terror and the revolution. So it could literally start anew like no other country in the West, which carried around, I mean, the United States kind of could drop the baggage of Europe, of 2,000 years of Europe, in the ocean as they came across. As a result of which, as Victor said, this is the oldest constitutional democracy in the world. It's 225 years old. I cannot count how many constitutions in Europe were torn up, trampled, and burned in that time. It is also apparently the American dream, which is an American invention, seems to work because otherwise you wouldn't have 1.5 million foreigners, one of them legal, the other half illegal, flock to the United States. That is, apparently there are enough other people to believe in this exception to at least make it a real dream, one that still exists. Now, we have to separate that from the other idea of whether it's an indispensable hyperpower. That's again another conversation, but I'd like to say something here and also follow up on something that Victor said. The American role has been unique and indispensable in the sense that it turned away 4 massive authoritarian or totalitarian challenges to the rest of the world. That was Wilhelmine Germany, it was Hitlerian Germany, it was Japanese totalitarianism, and finally Soviet totalitarianism. That's not bad as far as indispensability is concerned. And so you see that it's very hard to conceive another nation, the Chinese, the Russians, Japanese, taking on this task of world order, which the US has inherited from the Brits, by the way, also liberal power, also democratic power. So apparently, the nice thing about these liberal Anglo empires, insular empires, is that they, while they follow their own egotistical, selfish interests, they somehow manage to serve the interests of a lot of other nations, which is why the burden of empire is very light compared to, say, the Soviet Empire.
How about their own interests? The empires.
Sorry?
No, how about the empire's own interests? I mean, you present empires as being so wonderfully benign, serving the interests of humanity, bearing the burden, white man's burden.
Let me repeat. I said liberal empires, by their nature, manage to pursue their selfish interests in a way which also serves the interests of others. And that's what I tried to explain by turning away the totalitarian challenges. And by the way, let me say something about the conflict of values, as in the list by Seymour Martin Lipset. Look, every ideology, whether it's the Soviet or the liberal ideology, is rent by conflict, say between liberty and equality. And the United States has been a country rent by conflict. Start with the Jeffersonians hashing it out with the Adamites, and both of them ganging up against the Hamiltonians. So ideological conflict is as American as apple pie. It is not a sign of health, rather a sign of disease, sign of health. Now, take the Soviet Constitution. It is rife with all these wonderful liberal values: liberty, equality, freedom of the press, democracy, you name it. But in that conflict, you ended up in the Gulag or dead. And that's the difference between the kind of ideological conflict in a liberal country like the United States and a totalitarian system like the Soviet Union.
Mark Rice, let me follow up with you, because indeed, all of what Joseph Joffe says notwithstanding, people can go visit your blog if they want, called Ranking America, which takes a somewhat different view of this. And I wonder if you could just give us some of the history there. Why did you start Ranking America to begin with?
Mostly in response to students who come into some of the American Studies classes I teach, presuming that the United States is the best. And whenever I asked them what they mean by the best, to explain what that means, they were at a loss for words. Sometimes they meant richest, sometimes they meant most powerful, sometimes they meant freest. But they just had the rhetoric, the story of exceptionalism. They bought into it, that the United States was somehow above and beyond all other countries in all measures that matter. And so I decided to put this together and just see how much data I could get out there onto the blog. Some of it is quite serious in terms of social indicators, economic indicators. Some of it's quite whimsical, but it raises to my mind the whole question of, what does it even mean to be number one? Number one in what way? And in a lot of the things that that a lot of Americans believe we're number one in, we are in fact not number one. And so I think that sometimes this the rhetoric of exceptionalism, the story of exceptionalism, gets in the way of Americans being able to see with a clearer vision where we actually do excel and where we actually need some changes or some rethinking about the way we go about doing
Once your website was hot and your students had a chance to look at it, did it give them pause?
It did, yeah. In fact, I've designed a class around it, getting students to seek out this kind of data themselves. And in terms of the analysis of the data, we're not really number crunchers. We find rankings that exist out there, and we visualize them with pretty simple bar graphs and pie charts and things along those lines. But just getting students to go into something like the Heritage Foundation and the rankings of economic freedom and see where the United States falls in those measures, freedom from corruption, economic freedom in general, makes them really think with a different set of data, different set of standards about what it is that this country is all about and how they view themselves in relationship to where we're at and what their values are and how they might want to move forward.
So Victor, get our heads around all of this if you would help us on that. On the one hand, we see this portrait of American exceptionalism. We see this portrait of a country that is very powerful, both militarily, economically, in terms of its academia. And Victor Davis Hanson, pick up on this. On the one hand, we have all of that, but on the other hand, we have Mark Rice's blog, which shows America to be woefully behind so much of the rest of the world in metrics that many people would consider to be very important. Figure that all out for us, if you would.
It's partly because we're the third largest country in the world, and we're completely different than India or China. We're trying to do things that no other country does. I live in a state where there's 6 million illegal aliens, mostly from Oaxaca province, and people who come without even a high school diploma. They don't know English, and yet they're integrated right into the California school system. And so if you look at third generation Hispanic Americans test scores, they pretty much are not that different than Italian Americans were relative in the 19th, early 20th century. If you add in 14 million illegal aliens, then yes, then our test scores in California look like they do in Mississippi. We have, if you look at African Americans, for example, it's another large minority group of over 30 million people. Per capita income, African Americans here have a higher income than any African expatriate community in the world. But if you look at the inner city, it's not that case. So what I'm trying to suggest to you is that nobody's ever tried what we're trying to do. We've got 320 million people in a vast we're a continental country, and we have an enormously liberal immigration policy where we're trying to integrate people en masse, legally, illegally, and it's not that easy to do. And what always astounds me is not that we're in some particular poll 20th or our kids score, I don't know, 11th or 12th or 18th in the world on math and science compared to a liberal democracy with 20 million or 30 million. It's mostly a homogeneous population, but that we do as well as we do. And there's no bigger fan of Canada than I am. But part of the reason that Canada has the luxury to try certain utopian bromides is because you've got this enormous economy right on your borders that has a voracious appetite from everything from Canadian oil to timber, and it has this enormous military.
Utopian bromides? There's
What?
nothing utopian about Canada. You mentioned utopian bromides that Canadians are in. What do you mean?
Well, I mean that you don't have to spend as much GDP on defense as we do, for example. And you can.
You don't have to spend so much either, by the way. Spending the equal of the rest of the world spends, having 600 military bases when there's no enemy.
Let me put it this way. If Mexico was where the United States is, the United States was where Mexico is, Canada would have different challenges.
That seems fair enough. Let's try this. Joseph Joffe, of all of the things that President Barack Obama has said over the past 4 years that have made conservatives crazy, I'm not sure this is at the top of the list, but it would be close to it, again, on this issue of exceptionalism. He said this back at the NATO summit in France in 2009. I believe in American exceptionalism, just as I suspect that the Brits believe in British exceptionalism and the Greeks believe in Greek exceptionalism. When you heard him say that, what did you think?
Well, I already said what I had to say, that there is a reality, and I tried to count off a few of them, a reality that makes America exceptional. And it really has to do with the fact that the United States started out way down the historical list and could therefore shed a number of historical burdens and handicaps that the Europeans are still battling. So it makes a difference whether you start afresh in the 17th century or not, and whether you are safe on an island which need not fear foreign invasions, And therefore, I think the less threat there is, the more liberty can flourish in a country. Same thing for Britain, less so in France or Germany or Spain. And so these are just some historical facts which have nothing to do with ideology. Now, exceptionalism is an ideology too. It is, in a way, the modern version of the chosen people. And I don't know about the Greeks, but the Greeks certainly did 2,500 years ago. The Brits had a sense of exceptionalism. The French certainly do. The Germans had it in a maybe less benign way. They no longer do. But that is, I don't think that is not the issue. Exceptionalism is a classic national or nationalist ideology. I just would say that the critical items in the American experience are there for each to see. And by the way, students, boy, that's another story. I asked my American students in a top school like Stanford when the American Constitution was written, and they cannot tell me, but that's just an anecdote that teachers would like to tell. I just maybe add one thought. This is an amusing debate, in part a very ideological one, in part a very sober academic one, fact-based. But isn't the fact that there are four people from different cultures talking about America, isn't that the most interesting illustration of American exceptionalism and American power that we should talk about? We don't talk about the decline of France or Italy or India, or when we talk about Russia, we talk vaguely about threats or about its
That depends on the viewpoint.
authoritarianism, but nobody talks about Canadian decline. Maybe because the United States matters so much to everybody.
That too is irrefutable. Sergei, did that comment from Barack Obama's trouble you at all?
No, it didn't trouble me at all, and I think it was a polite thing for him to say. And indeed, it's true that every country, no matter how large and small, is unique and likes to think of it as unique. Now, on the other hand, by the way, in the course of the campaign, Barack Obama has invoked the notion of American exceptionalism, urging the Americans to do better in order to prove that indeed this is a special country and so on and so forth, which is what you can expect to do, whether you're in Albania or Georgia, wherever. The important thing about the United States and its uniqueness is that this is the country which for the bulk of the 20th century has sought to shape a world order which will be congruent with its interests and its values. And indeed, by the end of the century, with the collapse of communism in Europe, it achieved that goal. And there was that triumphalism about the end of history, and there was this, heady feeling in 1991, 92 that we've made it, right? But now there seems a growing feeling we have met the enemy and it is us, because the world reshaped more or less according with the American plan turns out to be not very hospitable. For one thing, this is a world where good American jobs are disappearing and they're going to places like China and India and Bangladesh and so on and so forth. But this is what it was supposed to be, a world of free trade. That's why the American incomes are stagnating. That's why the Americans are feeling that, their social mobility is disappearing. That's why they can't get around the business of creating reforms which would make their lives better. And at the same time, around the world, there's a feeling that, hey, the United States actually is not playing a positive role in the world.
Well, you're leading me with just a few minutes to go here to politics, and given that we're a week away from the election, less than a week away from the election, let's finish up with this. Here's Scott Shane writing in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago. Talking about the candidates. The candidate might try to stir up his audience by flipping a familiar campaign trope, America is indeed number one, he might declare, in locking its citizens up with an incarceration rate far higher than that of the likes of Russia, Cuba, Iran, or China, in obesity, easily outweighing second-place Mexico and with nearly 10 times the rate of Japan, in energy use per person, with double the consumption of prosperous Germany. How far would this truth-telling candidate get? Nowhere fast. Such a candidate is, in fact, all but unimaginable in our political culture. Of their serious presidential candidates, and even of their presidents, Americans demand constant reassurance that their country, their achievements, and their values are extraordinary. Victor Davis Hanson, is that true? Do Americans constantly need reminding that they're number one?
Well, only because, as we've gone through this discussion, that they have these a singular military, a singular economy that's not explicable by their population. I've lived in Europe for 3 years. I travel quite frequently across the world. I've never heard a political leader in an Arab country or in a European country that didn't try to convince his population that in some ways they were exceptional and that the world looked toward them. Sometimes when I was in a country like Greece, you would have thought that Greece was running the entire global economy, or that France's military was back in the age of Napoleon. So that's a human trait. That's not an American trait for an American leader, in the manner of all leaders in constitutional societies, to try to reassure their constituencies that they're exceptional.
But Mark Rice, do you feel that Americans need constant reassurance from politicians that they're still number one?
No, I think that politicians might think that, but I don't think Americans actually need that. But yeah, I think that this feeds into, again, the myth of exceptionalism, that the two main candidates for the presidential election can point to the other parties and say, it's simply a matter of fixing those policies. If we just adopt ours instead, then all the bad things will go away and we will rightfully take our place as number one in the world again, if we're not still there. The story of decline will just go away. So I don't think Americans need it, but I think that politicians feel that it's important to say it.
Joseph Joffe, in your travels, does it feel to you like Americans need to be number one and need to feel and be told that by their politicians, that they're still number one?
Well, first off, factually, they are number one in the critical categories of power that I mentioned. I mean, there's just no debate on that, which is not to say that the United States does not lead the world in some pathologies or dysfunctionalities. I could probably rattle off a list of 100. But we are talking about decline. Decline means power in the world compared to others. So there is no need for assurance. Now, if you want to put on my journalistic hat and talk about moods, I don't think that's uppermost in the mind of your regular American. And all the opinion polls tell us what really matters is the state of the economy, which has been in dire straits before. There were worse recessions than this one, but not as long as this one, and not as slow in the recovery of the labor market. So I think that's rightly on people's minds. By the way, certain pathologies have declined very nicely. Crime has, for instance, in the United States, declined precipitously since the 90s. So there's also good stuff happening. And the reason I think why we can't tell an American anymore from the rest of the world is that the world dresses and eats and sings and dances and watches America.
Indeed. Let me jump in here. Leave the last 30 seconds for Sergei.
Okay, when an American reads the founding document of the American Republic, what does he read? He reads, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I don't want the Americans to lose their memory of that or their commitment to that. I don't want them to become cynical and say, hey, that's just propaganda.
Do you think they are?
No, I think that remains, that founding statement and other similar statements from the founding of the American Republic and its most glorious days remain an inspiration and a source for movements for change to make America better.
Well, American exceptionalism, I gather, is still up for debate, but what isn't was that you four were very exceptional today, and I want to thank all of you for coming on the program. Joseph Joffe from Hamburg, Germany. Victor Davis Hanson in Fresno, California.
Thank you.
Mark Rice in Rochester, New York, and Sergei Plekhanov from York University here in Toronto. Great discussion, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.